Welcome everyone to today's presentation on manufacturing options, bringing your product to market. So just a little bit before we get going too far here, a little bit about the Small Business Development Center. So we are a confidential, no-cost advisory service. We also provide low to no-cost training services as well, like the presentation today. So we are hosted by Cal Poly Humboldt, and then our primary funders are the federal SBA, Small Business Administration, as well as the state of California from the Governor's Office of Small Business and Economic Development. So Small Business Development Centers cover the U.S. There are 63 regions, several different centers, throughout the states. Our center here in Northern California, we service Shasta, Trinity, and Siskiyou counties. And again, if you are outside of our area, there is another SBDC office that serves you. But yeah, just a little bit about our advisors, who we assist with our advising, again, at no cost to you. So lots of different topics, whether it's, you're starting a business, wanting to grow your business, have questions about accounting, marketing, obtaining funding, writing a business plan, all that stuff and more. That's what we're here to assist with. And then there's also other advisors throughout our network as well. And I do have to read this before we get going. It's our disclaimer. So the information provided in this webinar and any supplementary materials provided to registrants are intended for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute professional, financial, or legal advice. No registrant should act or fail to act on the basis of any material contained in this webinar without obtaining proper financial, legal, or other professional advice specific to their situation. The Northern California Small Business Development Center and its host, the Cal Poly Humboldt Sponsored Programs Foundation, specifically disclaims any liability, loss, or risk, personal or otherwise, which is incurred as a consequence, directly or indirectly, of the use and application of any of the information presented in this webinar. All right, and then we do have a couple of presenters today, so I will hand it off to Bryan to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bryan Rheem, and I am a business advisor with the local SBDC office here in Redding, California. As you can see, I have over 25 years in business consulting in both public and private. I have had the privilege of helping several manufacturer companies launch locally and across the nation. And that's kind of one of my passions is business startups, helping small businesses scale and grow, and also helping businesses adopt IT for their own strategy and transformation. And I'll talk to you guys in a little bit.
Hi, everyone. My name is David Walker. I'm a former entrepreneur and business executive, been around a while. Founded a couple of tech companies, and I've been with Small Business Development Centers for about the last 6 years. And I wanted to share, before we get into this, wanted to share the main reason that I have for participating in this particular webinar. This is the first time we've done this one. Bryan and I developed it over the last few weeks, and the reason we decided to do this one really has to do with the fact that since 1990, I've counseled over 800 small and medium businesses over, off and on for many, many years. And one of the most common, I can't say it's the question we get most often, but it is a very common question. And that's, how do I bring my product to the market? Should I make it myself? Should I license it? Should I have somebody else make it for me? And how do I make that decision? And we thought, well, maybe it's worth talking about from a 10,000-foot level, because everybody's situation is different. Everybody's unique. Everybody has a different set of skills, different finance availability to them. So the answer is different for everybody. And so we wanted to talk about some of the factors that are involved in making this decision about how specifically you're going to bring a product you have to the market. So this is what we're going to talk about. I'm going to go through some of the manufacturing options, factors that you would want to consider. Bryan will talk about manufacturing in-house and contract manufacturing, and they'll talk about licensing, and we'll wrap up. So what is manufacturing? Manufacturing, I think we all kind of know what it is. It's the process of turning raw materials or parts into finished goods. And there are a lot of factors involved in manufacturing. If you've never run a manufacturing plant, if you've never set up a production line, there are just a ton of things that are involved in that process. And depending on how complex your product is, there's a lot of equipment, there's a lot of steps, there's a lot of planning that has to happen. You have supply chains, design and R&D, you have testing and customer validation you have to go through, equipment, tooling that needs to be developed. And like we were saying, each product, each thing that you want to bring to the market is unique, and each situation is unique. And there are different costs associated with it, different risks associated with it. And sometimes one way to approach the market is going to be more advantageous for you than another. So we're going to talk about this and just talk about some of the things you need to consider when making this decision. So in-house manufacturing means, just so that we're all on the same page here, you manufacture the product yourself. You maintain all the intellectual property rights, and you're responsible for sales and customer interaction. Okay. Contract manufacturing is when we're talking about when you hire someone else to make the products for you. And you might want to do this, especially if you have, if you're looking at spending a whole lot of money on equipment, a whole lot of money on setting up a manufacturing plant, and you're not sure you want to take that risk right away. It could involve everything from design, manufacturing, or shipping, but you get to retain the intellectual property rights. You're still responsible for the sales and the customer interaction, but somebody else might make the product for you. Well, there are risks there. And there are also less risk financially than if you were to go out and buy a $20,000 or $30,000 piece of equipment that you might need, when you can hire somebody else who already has that piece of equipment to go make it for you. So contract manufacturing is the second thing we'll be talking about. And then finally, licensing, which is the idea that if you own the intellectual property, you have a patent and you have the intellectual property secured, you can just license that to somebody who already has the means to manufacture the product, already has existing market paths, already has a complementary product perhaps that this thing would go well with. And you can license it to them and get paid a lump sum, or get paid on royalties on sales that they make, or some kind of combination. And we'll talk about that as well. So the factors, what do you consider in making this decision? And there's a lot of things to consider. Now, you'll be getting copies of these slides. If when you registered for this webinar, you'll get a copy of the slides, so you'll be able to go through this. And a copy of this is going on YouTube, so you can review it there as well. So we're going to have a lot on here. Don't feel like you have to write it down and it'll be gone forever. Well, you'll be getting a copy of the slides. The factors to consider. You're going to need to buy materials. You're going to need to have parts made. You're going to have, and involved in that, you're going to have some supply chain requirements that can affect your scheduling, can affect your costs. But it's something you're going to have to get. It's a risk. It's a factor to consider, because it's something you're going to have to get in place if you're going to manufacture these in-house. Do you have the ability to transform those raw materials and turn them into products? Do you have the people available to help you do that? Are you going to be able to actually make this thing work? Specialized tooling, specialized equipment. Do you have that available to you? You need to make sure that that's available before you decide you're going to go ahead and try to manufacture it yourself, and maybe try to obtain tooling somewhere. And then financial. And this is obviously one of the most important things to consider, because if you're thinking about buying equipment, if you're thinking about buying tooling, designing tooling, hiring engineers to get this stuff done, not to mention the raw materials, the other parts you're going to need to make this work. You should develop a cash flow for each, financial projections essentially for each method. Are you going to make it in-house? What does that look like on a cash flow? What does that look like on a forecasted profit and loss statement? Are you going to manufacture it yourself? Are you going to contract parts of it or all of it out to somebody else? Might cost more per unit, but a lot of the risk is gone. But still, it costs more per unit. So you need to understand how that looks. Licensing. If you're going to have somebody else manufacture this and you're going to license the intellectual property to somebody else, that's fine. Recognize that your potential for profits is going to drop significantly because instead of getting the net profit on the sales, you're getting only a small percentage of the revenue. And then there's timeline and opportunity costs. Maybe you've got something that is going to be a really big seller, but maybe it's only going to affect the market for a limited amount of time. Maybe it's only going to be a limited seller within a window. So what does that do to you? If it's going to take you a while to ramp up manufacturing, you may have lost the opportunity. So that's another factor to consider. Do you have the work people available? Do you have the workforce available locally? If you live in Reading, there aren't a lot of, maybe chemical engineers up here in Reading, perhaps. And if that's what you need, then maybe you need to think of something else. What do you have the workers available that you're going to need to staff your effort? And do you have the actual physical location available to you? These are some of the factors that you're going to need to consider when you look at each one. And each one of these, whether you're in-house manufacturing, contractor, licensing, and all of them mean that you're going to take a risk. And that's really what you're looking at. What is your appetite for risk? Because the risks are higher and the revenue potential, the profit potential is higher when you go through to in-house manufacturing, and it's significantly lower when you're looking at licensing. And these are the risks you need to consider. Capital, how much money you're going to put up front, product liability, errors and omissions, supply chain risks, workforce risks. These are all the risks you need to consider. And what is your financial capability to assume those risks? And what's your personal tolerance for risk? Some people can handle certain levels of risk more than others. And so these are the factors you need to consider. And as I was just saying, the higher the risk, the higher the reward. And the lower the risk, the lower the reward. If you do in-house manufacturing, it's going to cost you a lot more, but the potential reward is higher. So are the potential losses. It's the risk. Contract manufacturing would be in the middle. Licensing, if you choose the correct licensee, you'll have a much lower risk, but you're not going to make nearly as much money necessarily as if you did it yourself, compared to if you did it yourself and were successful. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bryan, and Bryan's going to do an overview of manufacturing in-house.
All right, thank you, David. So yes, this is an overview of, we're going to be talking about all the three manufacturing options in this, and I'm going to start with manufacturing in-house. After I cover manufacturing in-house, I'll cover contract manufacturing, and then I'll pass it over to David for licensing. So next slide, please. So as we talked about, manufacturing in-house is where you actually are doing all of the work. Now, this can be a large production plant where you are employing 50 to 100 plus people, or it could just be yourself in your garage. So in-house manufacturing has a lot of options when it comes. It's not just large plants where you're outputting thousands of products. It could just be you just by yourself, but all the risks, all the factors to consider are always all the same. So in-house, again, you're manufacturing it yourself. You're retaining all the intellectual property rights because it's just you and your team. It could be you, it could be you and a team. And you typically may be doing all the work from sourcing, your supply chain, designing it, building it, selling it, interacting with the customer, or you're bringing on team members to do specific pieces of that. But you as an entity, your organization, you're doing all of that. And so your responsibility is really, really big, right? You're responsible, like I said, for the whole life cycle of manufacturing. So where are you going to get your parts? Where are you going to get your raw goods? How much they cost? How are you going to put them together? How are you going to, refine and transform those materials into parts? Does it actually work? You're going to run quality assurance, quality control on the products. Is it up to standard? And then obviously you're dealing with the actual sales component, shipping those out, keeping an inventory. So, all of that, you think of in-house as you're doing all of that activity for your product. So it's something to consider. Even if you're just doing something in your garage, do you have the ability to kind of manage, or can you assemble the team to manage all of those steps from start to finish? Next slide. So the potential costs that we're talking about when you're thinking of manufacturing in-house, one is the space, right? So like I said, you could maybe have a shed, or maybe you have your garage, or you're working somewhere. You need a space that we like to call as a sanitized area, where you're not going to get things mixed up, or someone's going to accidentally walk away with a part. So you don't necessarily want to do it in your kitchen. So you want a suitable sanitized space just for the manufacturing. So, you don't have mix up, you don't lose parts, you can keep things clean. And then something to think about is also space required for your parts. There is just-in-time manufacturing where you receive an order and then you go and source the goods, but that's very, very risky, because what if you all of a sudden can't find it? Now you have someone who's paid. So typically you're thinking about a space for the manufacturing and a space for storage of the goods, parts, and the completed products before you ship them out. You obviously need the tools. So it could be as complicated as CNC machines, needed to, and welding machines, all the way to, hey, I'm just building birdhouses. And so you just need saw and a sandpaper. Regardless, you're going to need the tooling and the equipment necessary to manufacture your product. So that's the cost. And then the upkeep and maintenance of those tools. Things break, things wear out. And so having a budget for tools and equipment, and then obviously the purchase of raw materials or parts. So all the things that go in, it's not just the core raw materials, it's the little components like the glue, screws, nails, whatever, paint, or the parts that you're going to assemble together. And then it's always a good idea to have, an excessive amount, because things break. There are defects when even you receive raw materials or parts. So you want to try to minimize your supply chain. So you're going to plan on purchasing them, and there's an economy of cost to the economy of scale. So when you buy things in bulk, your price goes down, but that means you're spending more to buy things in bulk. So all those are things to consider when it comes to your potential costs. And finally, your labor and your workforce. It could be you. Are you going to pay yourself? Hopefully. Are you hiring someone to do certain components? Are you hiring someone to do books? You're doing your sales, upkeep your website. Those are all the things to consider as far as potential costs go. Next slide. Also, there's research and development. So there's the investment in creating an initial prototype. The first time you build something, you don't want to ship that. So you're going to invest in all of that, what we just talked about, all those costs and all that process to develop what we call it a minimum viable product, your MVP, just the amount of the product to sell, or a prototype, and you might iterate through several design. So that's all going to be cost, because you're probably not going to sell those items, right? That's just for your internal development or refining your product. And then a cost is you're going to be improving in product design. So again, your R&D doesn't stop once you start shipping that initial product. Maybe you want to do some more research and design to continuously improve. And then you have your insurance and liability, your general business insurance, product liability, depending on what the product is. If you're going to have employees, you need to have all that stuff related to employee insurance. And then maybe you're offering some sort of warranty on your product. So the process, like we talked about, is you determine what you want to build. You understand your requirements, like how much space do you need? What are the tools? What are the materials? All the things that go into the final product. What type of labor and time is required. Then you need to find the space. Like I said, it could be a shed. It could be you lease a space. Could be your garage. You find, according to your requirements, that space that's suitable. You purchase, obviously, all the tools, all the materials you need to get going. If you need to hire people, you have that process of finding the people with the skills that are going to help you be successful. You get all that together in the space, and then you conduct some R&D. You produce a working prototype. You figure out, is this actually viable? Can we actually build this? And then you build, and sell. And in that process, you have feedback loops. You have quality assurance, quality control checks. You're making sure things are happening the way you plan them to happen. And you're making adjustments along the way, depending on the output of your product. What are the risks? As David mentioned, you have a higher upfront cost. You're purchasing all those things. You're purchasing all those supplies. Supply chain can have a major impact on your ability to manufacture. If you have a unique part that you need, and that part is all of a sudden out of stock. So we saw that with cars, right? That chip in Japan went missing, and all of a sudden no one could push out cars. So there's much more supply chain risk when you're the one responsible for your supply chain. You have workforce issues, finding the labor. Obviously, if you have unique tools and equipment, that could be an issue, expensive to repair, expensive to find. And then there's a rising cost that impacts your profitability, as well as increased liability, because you have people in your space. Even if it's you have people in your space, and so you have injuries, and you're responsible for the product output. So you are dealing with any issues with your manufacturing process. What are the pros, though? You have complete control of your product. So if you have a high standard of excellence or want your product to be distinguished because of excellence, you are able to control every step of the way, and you control all of your intellectual property. There's less risk of your IP getting leaked out, because it's just your team that's exposed to it. You are directly involved in the production and the quality and the process. So you can make changes very quickly through feedback. And so you realize those improvements immediately because you're the one doing the production. And again, like we said, you have more potential for profit as you optimize and continuously improve. Your margins grow and grow. You have greater flexibility to make changes. You don't have to negotiate with the outsourced company, and you have much better control over the QC. You're right there seeing things, and you determine when things passes or not. And then you're not kind of subject to dealing with an outside company that could be not even in your geographic location. So you have much more control of the output, and you're able to immediately see, okay, do we need more supplies? Do we need more labor? What's going on with our equipment? You just are in the weeds and able to make adjustments as necessary. And what are the cons? Like we talked about, it's higher cost. There's much more things to manage, right? Since you're end to end. You could invest a lot in the R&D, and you could make multiple iterations to find that final efficient process. Again, you're fully responsible, so you're assuming all the risks and all the costs. And then you have to manage, again, the R&D, the MVP, and you're managing inventory, both from a supply chain and also from your finished goods. Where do you store those? How do you track them? So you're accounting for a lot more detail and data. All right. So that concludes our in-house. Now we're going to go to contract manufacturing. As we said, this webinar is focused on 3 types of ways to bring your product to market. We just covered in-house manufacturing. Now I'm going to cover contract manufacturing, and David will finish with licensing. So let's go into contract. Next slide. What does contract mean? Contract means you have the idea, but you are not going to do the manufacturing yourself. You're going to hire another manufacturing company to actually create the product. You could even involve them in the design. You can involve them in the shipping. There's a lot of there's some flexibility in your ability to grow their scope or shrink their scope based on what you're able to do. You still retain all the intellectual property, and typically you're responsible for the sales and customer interaction. It's useful if you need to scale up quickly and you don't have the space, the tools, the labor, right? So there are some pros that we'll talk about. And sometimes it just makes more sense financially to mass produce somewhere else. Typically, when you're dealing in bulk quantities, you're not doing one-offs or very low volume custom stuff. But when you're producing bulk widgets, bulk product, and for a startup, when you don't have the resources to stand up your own manufacturing process. Next slide. So what are the potential costs? You have higher level legal fees because you're dealing with the contract entity. And so you really need to protect your intellectual property, but also you need to set the contract for expectations and boundaries. We call this a contract manufacturing agreement. So everything is going to be in that contract when things go right and when things go wrong, especially when things go wrong. What's going to happen? How do you rectify it? How do you escalate it if there's disagreement? All that really needs to be set up front. And so your legal fees are going to be higher. Your research and development, there's still potential costs. You're going to have to pay them to create those initial prototypes, and you're not going to sell them. So that's kind of the same, like in-house. And then you have your manufacturing fees. The way it usually works is you pay them for their cost plus their additional fees. So like David had mentioned in the beginning, your price per product is going to be more than if you were to manufacture that in-house, because you're covering their costs plus their additional fee. And then your profit is whatever's left over from that. And then travel fees, typically, unless you found a manufacturing down the street, you're going to have to visit because you're going to want to validate and see firsthand what their process is, what their QC is like. And obviously you're going to potentially want to meet and greet before you enter into a manufacturing agreement. Next slide. So what's that process? You still have to determine what are you going to sell? What are you actually building? But now you really have to describe that through documentation. Obviously in-house, you might do that as well, but you're taking more time to make sure, because someone else is reading these that you might not have direct interaction with. You're going to find the appropriate manufacturer. There's a lot. There's here, in state, there's in nation, there's overseas. So a lot of options. So you're doing that work to find the manufacturer that fits your requirements. You're entering into that agreement. You're setting up the non-disclosure agreement so that they're not going to steal your intellectual property. And you're still responsible for, the design, but they are, responsible for all the elements of the production. You're talking about how many products are delivered in what time frame. How do you terminate that contract? You're dealing with all of that with your selected manufacturing organization. and they'll probably be back and forth, right, until you settle on terms. They'll start manufacturing, and then you figure out what that feedback loop looks like. You're not there on site to see firsthand, and how do you actually implement changes? Like, you don't like how something's happening, so they're responsible for figuring out how they're going to adjust, and then you're responsible. That might result in fee changes, escalation of costs. Ultimately, again, you're responsible for the product and the customer satisfaction. Next slide. So what are the risks? Obviously, there's a very high risk for intellectual property to be leaked. Someone else now has access to your secret sauce. Yes, you have a manufacturing contract agreement, but Amazon will quickly show that a lot of people don't care. Amazon is full of knockoffs now that have flooded the market, and so they're stealing people's intellectual property. And a lot of times, it's hard to go after, especially if you are contract manufacturing overseas. There's maritime law, but who knows what the course of action is. So that's just a huge risk, and a huge cost to pursue that legal course of action. You're kind of at the mercy of another entity. Now, that might be good, but that might be bad as well, because you're subject to their delays. You really don't have direct control. You're just another contract to them. You still are subject to all the typical manufacturing issues that cause delays. It's just not your responsibility to resolve it, but you're still directly impacted by it. And then you don't have direct input and insight into their process like you would if it's in-house. There's a delay enabled to pivot. You're not there, and it takes time because they have other obligations, or maybe you're one of 20 products that are on this assembly line, and so you can't pivot a design if it's different from all the other things that they're working on. And then quality control is a little bit more of an issue because you're not there on site, and obviously, you're not. Liability increases because they might be shipping things, and you're not there to manage the QC. Next slide. So what are the pros? There's less upfront costs because someone else is doing the manufacturing for you. They're responsible to source the goods and the equipment, and ideally they already are set up for that, right? They're already set up to produce what you want to produce, and that's why you're going to contract with them. You're not dealing with staffing, so there's less overhead costs, and all those related issues. And then it's a faster spin-up time. Again, you're not having to buy and do all this purchasing and worrying about labor, so you're able to spin up because ideally there's someone already doing the work, and it's just getting into a contract with them, and you're able to realize profits sooner. Smaller margin of profit, but sooner revenue. Allows you to expand and grow output faster. You don't have to buy additional equipment, hire additional people. You rely on them to scale, and typically they have the means to scale because you're not the only one that they're doing manufacturing for. And then so you minimize risk because you're not dealing with equipment failure and dealing with labor issues, and so you're kind of reducing the risk. It provides more consistent financials with known profit margins. You're entering into a contract agreement. They're responsible to produce a certain amount by a certain time. You know what you're going to sell it for. You know what their cost is. So you're able to kind of predict more your profit margins. And usually they have more technical expertise. They're experts in manufacturing. And so you're able to leverage their knowledge and their experience and their input. What are the cons? Obviously, you're putting your product in the hands of someone else, and nobody cares more about your product than you. You are client 1, 4, 6, 7, 8, right? And not to say that they won't care about your product, but they're never going to have the same ownership that you have. So when it comes to excellence and output and quality, that's kind of a con. And then obviously, your intellectual property is could be leaked, could be copied, could be stolen, right? There's greater production cost just because you're paying for their cost plus profit. So it's easier to spin up and you realize revenue, but over the long term, you're going to end up paying more over the long term. Again, let me make that clear. It's cheaper probably to stand up quickly with contract manufacturing, but over the long term, it's going to cost you more. Little to no control over their manufacturing process. Again, why are they going to change? They have other clients, or they've probably been doing this way. So your cost savings, you might not be able to realize them. And then like a long lead time, the resolution with issues you may have. Next slide. So that concludes it, and I'm going to turn it over now to David to cover licensing.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, let's talk about licensing then, which is an alternative to manufacturing the product yourself or having somebody else manufacture it. And we'll go through it and give you some ideas along these lines. So what is licensing? The idea is you own a patent or you have a trade secret and you're assigning those rights to another company. Basically, a license is a contract. It's an agreement between you, the owner of the intellectual property, that makes you the licensor, and the licensee, the one that is the party that's acquiring the rights to that intellectual property to go make or have products made based on that intellectual property, that patent or that trade secret. The licensee is responsible for the manufacturing. They're generally responsible for sales, customer interaction, customer satisfaction, and you, as the inventor, as the owner of the patent, as the owner of the trade secret, you sit back and you collect royalties on sales, or you collect a fee of some kind. And you really have very little to do with the actual sales, the actual manufacture of the product. And that's useful if you don't have a way to manufacture something. If you have an idea for something and you've protected it and you've got the rights to it, but you have no idea how to manufacture it, or you don't have the means to do it, this is a viable option. And if the licensee already has similar products or even competitive products, but they have existing market paths that they've developed over time, they're already experts in the area, then licensing might make perfect sense for your specific situation. So what are the costs? Well, the potential cost for you as the licensor is the legal fees. You have to protect your intellectual property. If you can't protect your intellectual property, you can't really license anything because it's not protected, right? If you have something that is in the public domain, then everybody has the right to it. So obviously there are legal fees that the licensor has to maintain. You're going to have to invest in some level of research and development, and that can vary depending on the terms of the license agreement. You may have a germ of an idea, but it may not be enough. It may not be proven enough to attract somebody who would want to license it and bring it to the market. So you're going to have to invest some effort to prove viability of your idea, or maybe create prototypes, or put together what Brian talked about, minimum viable product, an MVP. You are going to be responsible for some level of marketing the intellectual property to potential licensees and for managing the license agreement. Because part of managing the license agreement is auditing. You're going to want to audit. You're going to want to have the ability to audit the books of the licensee and make sure you're getting the royalties you should be getting. You're going to want to visit the licensee and make sure that they're performing in accordance with the license agreement. So there are costs for you as a licensor. And the way this works is the licensee, the one that's licensing the intellectual property from you, will need to pay you in some way. So they're going to have costs as well. This probably should say your potential income, but at any rate, the licensee, there's a number of ways you can set up the agreement so that you can get paid. Sometimes you can have just a lump sum, a single license payment, and basically just have the licensee give you a boatload of money for the license to the product, and then they enter into the license agreement, and or you assign the patent to them, a lump sum payment. It could be a milestone payment, especially if there's some development work to be done. There may be certain milestones in the development to meet. And the licensee, as they go along and meet those milestones, they make a payment. The milestones could be sales numbers. They sell 1,000 units, you know, and the license is set up for them to make a payment at that, and then another payment on the next milestone, and on it goes. Universities, when they develop intellectual property, many times they have option payments, option agreements, which basically gives a potential licensee the option to license the product. And in the meantime, they can do their own development, they can do their own validation of the idea first, and they pay a small fee for that. And then if at the end of the option, they can say, yes, I'm going to fully license it, or no, this isn't our cup of tea, or it's not going to work. The fee structure could be for a fixed fee per unit sold. Every time the licensee sells 10 units, they send you $1, you know, something like that, a fixed fee per unit sold. They could be royalties, which are on percentages of sales, just revenue at the end of every quarter for those potential products, or those products that use the technology. The revenues at each quarter, 5% goes to the licensor. And they, I'm not saying it's always 5% either. There's a whole range. Different industries generally will charge different fees, anywhere from 3% to 20%. Most of the ones I've seen are 5 to 7%, but it varies by industry, what the royalty would be. And an interesting thing that you should have in any license agreement is a minimum annual royalty, or a milestone payment of some kind. And the reason for that, the reason you want to have a minimum royalty is because you don't want to license your technology to someone and then have them do nothing with it. You need to be able to force them to actually sell the products based on the technology, and not just try to go bury the thing. So if you say that every quarter, no matter what, they have to pay you a certain amount of money, a minimum royalty, then that forces them to do something with the license, and not just bury it in favor of their own idea or something like that. And then sub-licensing. You may want to allow the licensee to have the rights to sub-license the agreement if they find someone that they can work with, and have yet another revenue stream through their effort, and they would want to sub-license the agreement. And that's another thing to consider here with licensing. So what's the process? The hardest part is finding potential licensees, and how do you do that? Because you want people who are qualified. You don't want to just, you know, license your technology to Joe's garage down the street, or your uncle, or whatever. You want somebody who's experienced in manufacturing similar products, probably. You probably want them to be complementary and not necessarily directly competitive with you, because you want them to be incentivized to sell your product as opposed to theirs, if there were a choice. So you want to make sure that they have the incentive to sell, you know, based on their own products and their own offerings. And you want them to have the existing market paths. You want them to have the experience. You want them to know what it is they're doing. They need to understand what the industry is. They need to understand the customers and the people who are going to be interested in buying this product. So how do you find these people? It isn't easy, but you can find some through industry publications. If you're looking for, I don't know, if you're looking for a sensor manufacturer, maybe you look in industry associations and see what sensor manufacturers are out there. You look at industry, you can look at their websites too, and look, make a list of people that work in the industry, do your own research, and look on their websites for product development. research. A lot of them will say B2B partners. A lot of them will say, hey, we want to work with you, and contact them that way. And then it becomes a negotiation, because ultimately, like I said, licensing is an agreement, and that agreement needs to be negotiated. And when we talk about negotiation, we talk about a number of factors, and these are some of the key elements that any license agreement is going to have. First, it's going to have a subject matter. What specifically is being licensed? And that needs to be very specific and very detailed. If you have a patent, it's going to be that patent number. It's going to be very specifically identified. This is what the company is licensing. This is what you are giving them the rights to. Now, then we talk about fields of use. What do those rights entail? When we talk about fields of use, they could be geographic or they could be industry. For instance, you might say, I'm going to license our product to this company so they can make and sell them in California, or in the United States, or in the Western United States, or in these states. It could be geographic. It could also be industry-wide. For instance, I was involved years ago with a company that was developing a new battery technology, and the licenses that they had were for specific industries. One was interested in the battery as it related to power tools, rechargeable batteries and power tools. The company had a license just for that. They couldn't sell the same battery technology for a cell phone or for an automobile or lanterns or whatever. They would just had power tools. So a field of use could be that. It could be a specific industry to sell the product. And then the license agreement is going to have milestones, like we mentioned, and that they have to sell so many units per quarter, and they're required to meet that, and there would be a minimum royalty associated with that. The length of the agreement, it could be, the license agreement could be for the life of the patent. It could be for whatever you perceive the actual life of the product is going to be. Maybe the life of the patent is 10 more years, but maybe the market opportunity is only going to be 5 years. Or it could be, just something small to start out with, and you can renew it for longer terms as you get more comfortable with the arrangement. And then there's a concept of exclusivity. Is this licensee going to have the exclusive rights to sell in this geographic area, or worldwide for everything, or just with some industry? Is that going to be exclusive, or is it going to be non-exclusive? Will you, as a licensor, be willing to license the technology to multiple companies? Generally speaking, a license that licenses to multiple companies will pay less royalties per license than someone who's exclusive. They'll generally have to pay more for that. So that's something that will need to be hammered out. And then the sub-licensing issue. Will the licensee be able to sub-license the technology if an opportunity came up? And then how will that work? How will you see the royalties on that sub-license agreement? And then the payments, when are the payments made and how are the payments made? And you want to make sure you have the ability to audit, the ability to go in and make sure that the licensee is performing in accordance with the license agreement. Excuse me a second. Sorry about that. Going further into the process, there are legal issues that need to be addressed and that you need to be aware of when you're talking about a license agreement. What happens if the licensee doesn't perform? What are the penalties? Do they lose the license? Does the license fee go down? How does that work? And you'll want to address that. Term and termination, we talked about that a little bit. How is the license agreement terminated? How is it continued as the term runs out? How do you continue that if you want to extend it? What happens if there's a patent infringement? What is your role as the owner of the intellectual property? What is the licensee's role? as the person that has licensed it. And like we said, clarity and specificity on what is being licensed, clarity and specificity on the limitations of that license, and the expectations. Specifically, what is it you expect a licensee to do? What are the milestones? How many units do you expect them to sell? How much are you expecting them to do perhaps some R&D to make the next version of the product? Stuff like that. Another thing to consider. Product improvements. Who's responsible for product improvements, and what happens to the license fee in the event of a major product improvement? So what are the risks? That has to do with what your risk tolerance is. What do you want in a licensee? You want financial strength. You want to make sure they're not going to license the thing and then go under. You want them to have market presence. You want them to have the capability to develop the product. And the other thing is you want them to have a reputation, and that's something that that's really important. They're representing a product that you created. You want them to have a sterling reputation, and you don't want them to taint your product, your concept in any way. So you want somebody that understands the industry, understands the competition, knows where they're at, and is going to be able to give you the best results as a licensee. The pros, a lot of lessened financial risks. You don't have to worry about creating tooling. You don't have to worry about buying expensive equipment. There's no need or limited need, perhaps, to conduct additional R&D because you've increased your chance of success by working with a viable, reliable licensee. You're working with somebody who already knows their stuff and already has the existing market paths and the ability to make and sell these products based on your technology very effectively. You don't have to manufacture them. The licensee has the experience. The licensee could have the capital equipment. You don't necessarily need to market and sell. The licensee should have the sales force in place. So you sit back, you collect royalties in a ideal world. So those are the pros of the licensing scenario. Of course, if you're manufacturing it and you're making 15% net profit at the end of the day, that's one thing. But if you're licensing it and you're making 5%, it's a lot less risk, but a lot less reward. And that's kind of the point that we're trying to get across here. Cons, you have to spend time and energy pitching the product to potential licensees. So there is a little bit of costs that are going to be involved. You're going to receive a comparatively smaller percentage of the profits. You have to relinquish some level of control over the invention. And like we were mentioning when we talk about reputation, poor performance by a licensee could damage goodwill and your reputation. So at this point, I think we're asking if we have any questions. So Emily, do we have questions?
So it looks like there aren't any in the chat right now. Oh, it looks like we have one. Is it feasible for the licensor to have complete product liability shielding indemnification?
I missed some of that because of the quality of my speaker, which is about 1 inch by 1 inch. I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, so is it feasible for the licensor to have complete product liability shielding indemnification?
Yeah, indemnification. Yeah, okay. All right. I was able to pull it up. Yeah, it is feasible, and it's probably worth doing because ultimately, especially if there's back up a little bit, just like if there's patent infringement, you're going to want, the licensor is going to want to have defined in the license agreement with the licensee what happens if somebody else is out there infringing on the intellectual property. So in the same way, you're a partner. with the licensee. So yeah, in the same way you're going to want to have liability insurance, you're going to want to have indemnification built in to the license agreement. There's going to be an indemnification clause that's going to say, hopefully, that the licensee is going to take that on. Practically, you'll want to have the insurance anyway, but that will be part of the license agreement. Is you'll be indemnifying each of the parties. So yeah, that is something that that you'll want to consider, that you'll want to have. Is it common or expected? I see this one. Is it common or expected to put all infringement policing costs on the licensee? Yeah, absolutely. You could, yeah, you would require the licensee to carry. You can require them to carry insurance. That could certainly be something you would negotiate in the agreement. And I'm sure those were parts of our agreements in the past. In fact, I know they were. That we would have to have product liability insurance. We would have to have general business insurance and general business liability. Yeah. While we're looking at this beautiful slide here, let me just say that if you have any questions about this, if you want to talk further or anything, this is our contact information. If you don't happen to be lucky enough to be living in Siskiyou, Shasta, or Trinity counties, there's an SBDC near you. We cover every county in the United States. Google SBDC and the name of your county, and you'll find an office there, and you'll find advisors who are experts in their fields who can answer any question you have. And if they don't know the answer, they'll know somebody who does. And it's all free for you, sort of. It's paid for through your taxes. So you're already paying for it, so you might as well use it. Okay, so that's what we got. Are there any other questions or anything there, Emily?
No, I think we're good on the questions. So I did put in the chat a little bit ago, and I'll go ahead and put it in again, a survey. And if you could fill this out, this really helps us out, lets us know how we did. If there's any other topics that you're interested in us teaching. So if you could go ahead and at least click on that now, and then, fill it out either now or after we close here. Yeah, that would be really great. See. Yeah, and thank you, David and Bryan, for teaching today. It was a very helpful webinar.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. We'll see you.
Bye-bye.